There's a $10,000 prize sitting on a stainless steel prep table in the middle of a professional kitchen, and not one of the 4 Red Seal chefs standing in that room could claim it. That was Thursday at Maison Vert, the most talked-about restaurant in downtown Halifax, Nova Scotia. A 32-seat room on Barrington Street with a 2-month wait list, a wine cellar that held 400 bottles, and a head chef named Dominic Farrell, whose photograph had appeared on the cover of Canada's 100 Best Restaurants 3 years running. The prize wasn't Dominic's idea. It belonged to Roland Ashby-Crane, 61 years old, the restaurant's owner, a property developer from Toronto who had moved to Halifax in his 50s and decided that what the city needed was the kind of restaurant that made people feel small when they walked in. He was built like a man who had once been athletic and had spent 30 years not caring about it. Gray suit, no tie, a watch that cost more than most people's cars. He had silver hair brushed straight back and eyes that moved around a room the way a security camera does. Slowly, without expression, recording everything. Roland had discovered the problem at 4:47 that afternoon. The main walk-in refrigeration unit had failed overnight. The compressor was dead, and inside were $14,000 worth of ingredients for the evening's service. Nova Scotia halibut, hand-dived scallops from Digby, dry-aged duck breast, a truffle-based sauce that had been reducing for 18 hours. Service started in 2 hours and 12 minutes. Roland called Gilles Trépanier first. Gilles was the best commercial kitchen technician in the Maritime Provinces, 44 years old, 3rd-generation refrigeration specialist, a man who could diagnose a glycol chiller by sound alone. Gilles showed up in 14 minutes with his apprentice and a diagnostic tablet that connected to the unit's control board wirelessly. He worked for 40 minutes. Then he stood up, pulled off his nitrile gloves, and shook his head once. "The compressor is seized. I can't free it. Not tonight. Not without pulling the entire unit. You need a replacement compressor, and the nearest one that fits this model is in Moncton. Earliest I can get it here is tomorrow morning." Roland looked at him. "Tomorrow morning is no help to me, Gilles. I understand that. I'm sorry. Get out of my kitchen." Gilles left without another word. His apprentice followed 2 steps behind, not making eye contact with anyone. Roland called Priscilla Markov next. Priscilla owned Advanced Thermal Solutions out of Dartmouth, industrial refrigeration contractor, licensed across 4 provinces. She had 17 years of experience and a reputation for the kind of diagnostic work that other technicians called in favors to observe. She arrived with 2 technicians, a thermal imaging camera, and a laptop with proprietary diagnostic software she had licensed from a manufacturer in Germany. She spent 35 minutes on the unit. Her verdict was the same as Gilles's, but she delivered it with more words and a printout. Seized compressor, catastrophic failure of the start capacitor, oil contamination in the suction line. The unit was effectively dead until replacements arrived. "Book the parts from Moncton," she said. "I'll install them first thing tomorrow." "I have 48 guests arriving in 90 minutes, Roland said. "I know. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do tonight." She was halfway to the back door when Roland's voice stopped her. "What am I paying you for?" Priscilla turned around. She was a compact woman with short red hair and the kind of stillness that comes from spending years in rooms where people got angry at things that were simply true. "You're paying me for an honest diagnosis," she said. "That's what I gave you." She left. Roland called a 3rd technician after that. Bernard Oduya, from Halifax Mechanical Services, 22 years in the trade, 3 commendations from the Nova Scotia Refrigeration Contractors Association, framed behind the reception desk at his shop on Agricola Street. Bernard arrived alone, looked at the unit for 25 minutes, confirmed everything the previous 2 had said, and added one detail. The thermal imaging showed a secondary failure forming in the evaporator coil that had been developing for weeks and nobody had caught. "This unit has been running on borrowed time," Bernard said. "Honestly, Mr. Ashby-Crane, whoever serviced this last didn't do their job." Roland turned to his chef. Who services this unit? Dominic Farrell, 39 years old, dark-haired, wearing his whites with the collar open, crossed his arms and said nothing. He had contracted the service agreement himself 18 months ago. He knew the answer. He had no intention of saying it out loud in front of Roland. Bernard packed up and left. Roland stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment. The sound of the kitchen was wrong. No hum from the compressor, no ambient cold. Just the ambient warmth of a Halifax afternoon coming through the ventilation, and the smell of $14,000 worth of food slowly crossing a line it couldn't come back from. He walked back to the prep table. He pulled out his wallet, counted 10 $1,000 bills, and laid them on the stainless steel in a flat row. $10,000, he said to the kitchen, to Dominic, to the two sous chefs, to the prep cook standing near the door, to nobody in particular. Cash, tonight, to anyone who can get that unit running before service. No one spoke. Dominic Farrell unfolded his arms and looked at the money. He had been cooking for 19 years. He knew kitchens, he knew food, he knew technique better than almost anyone in Atlantic Canada. He did not know refrigeration systems. Nobody in that kitchen did. The prep cook near the door, a young woman who had been hired 6 weeks ago to do vegetable work and stock prep, looked at the walk-in unit and then looked away. Her name was Soleil Ducasse-Brochu. She was 22 years old, Acadian, with dark hair pulled into a tight knot under her cap. She wore a white prep jacket 2 sizes too large that had someone else's name stitched on the chest pocket. Her shoes were black kitchen clogs with a crack running across the left toe that she had covered with black electrical tape. She had a smudge of carrot on her left forearm and flour dust on her collar. She had been standing in that kitchen for 4 hours prepping root vegetables, and in 4 hours, not one person had asked her name. She heard something the moment Gilles Trépanier arrived and opened the panel on the walk-in unit, a specific pattern in the silence. Not the silence itself, the shape of it. The way the ambient sound of the kitchen shifted when the compressor wasn't cycling, a frequency that wasn't there when it should have been. She had heard that absence before, many times, in a different kitchen in a different city a long time ago. But this wasn't her moment. She was a prep cook. She had been there 6 weeks. She kept her eyes on her cutting board. Then Roland laid the money on the table and said $10,000, and she looked at the walk-in unit, and something her grandmother had told her a long time ago came back to her all at once. You already know. You always already know. The only question is whether you have the nerve to say so. She set her knife down on the board, walked toward the unit, slowly, hands at her sides. What are you doing? Dominic Farrell said. I think I know what's wrong with it. He looked at her. He looked at her jacket with the wrong name on the chest. He looked at the electrical tape on her shoe. He looked at the smudge of carrot on her arm. Then he laughed, not loudly, worse than loudly, quietly. A private laugh shared with himself and with the two sous chefs, Claude Arsenault and Frédéric Desrosiers, who exchanged a look over her head. You think you know, Dominic said, what 3 licensed refrigeration technicians couldn't fix. Yes, you're a prep cook. Yes, you've been here 6 weeks. Yes. Claude Arsenault, 32 years old, tall, with the faintly condescending patience of someone who has never been wrong about anything he considered worth being right about, stepped away from his station and stood between Soleil and the unit. Why don't you go back to your vegetables, he said. We have real work to do. Soleil didn't move. Roland had been watching from the prep table. He hadn't said a word. He was the kind of man who understood power the way a chess player understands the board. Not piece by piece, but as a field of pressure. And right now he was watching a 22-year-old prep cook in someone else's jacket hold her ground against a chef with 3 industry awards, and he found it, against every expectation, interesting. Let her speak, Roland said. The kitchen went quiet. Dominic turned. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The particular recalibration of a man who has just realized his employer is watching more carefully than he thought. Mr. Ashby-Crane, she's a... I said, let her speak. Soleil walked to the walk-in unit. She opened the panel that Gilles had opened, the one Priscilla had opened, the one Bernard had opened. She didn't touch anything. She stood there for 23 seconds, with her eyes moving slowly across the components. Then she crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the compressor housing, held it there, tilted her head at an angle that no one in the kitchen had ever seen a person tilt their head at a refrigeration unit. "She's listening to it," Frederic Desrosiers said under his breath to Claude, and his voice was not entirely without wonder. "She's stalling," Claude said back, but his voice was quieter. Dominic crossed his arms again. "Clock is running, prep cook. Service in." He checked the clock above the pass, 78 minutes. Soleil stood up. She turned around. "Three things," she said. "The compressor isn't seized. The start capacitor failed, which made it look seized on the diagnostic readout, but the compressor itself is fine. Priscilla Markov's software was reading secondary resistance from the bad capacitor and flagging the whole unit as catastrophic. It isn't." The kitchen was very quiet. "The second thing," she continued, "is the overload protector. It tripped when the capacitor blew. It's been in thermal lockout for approximately 14 hours. It won't reset until it cools down enough, which it won't do on its own, because the ventilation gap on the back of the unit is blocked by a delivery pallet that's been there since last Tuesday." Claude turned and looked at the back of the walk-in unit. A wooden pallet from a produce delivery was pushed against the wall 6 inches from the ventilation exhaust. He said nothing. "The third thing," Soleil said, "is the start relay. It's on its way out. It didn't cause tonight's failure, but it'll cause the next one if nobody replaces it. That's a $40 part." Roland Ashby-Crane set his hands flat on the prep table. "And you can fix all 3 of these, Daces. The capacitor is on the panel shelf behind the secondary unit." Gilles Trepannier's apprentice knocked it off when he opened the panel access and set it on the shelf without knowing what it was. I watched him do it. She paused. "The overload protector just needs the pallet moved and time to cool. 20 minutes with the panel open and the airflow clear. The relay I can bypass temporarily tonight and order the replacement for tomorrow." Roland looked at her for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Soleil Ducasse Brochu." "How do you know any of this?" She looked at him steadily. "My mother owns a refrigeration and HVAC business in Moncton. I've been working in her shop summers and weekends since I was 11. I have my Class B refrigeration certificate. I applied to this kitchen because I want to cook, not because I don't know anything else." The silence that followed that sentence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in a professional kitchen is a very long time. Dominic Farrell opened his mouth, closed it. Roland picked up one of the $1,000 bills from the table and turned it in his fingers. "Then why?" he said, voice careful, measured, the voice of a man who asks questions he already knows the answers to. "Didn't you say something an hour ago?" Soleil looked at him without hesitation. "Because nobody asked me." At the back of the kitchen, half hidden by the shelving unit near the dry storage entrance, a woman had been standing for the past 11 minutes who had come in through the serf's entrance looking for Roland on a property matter, and stayed when she heard the argument develop. Her name was Marguerite Ouellette Poirier. She was 66 years old, francophone, white-haired, wearing a blazer over a silk blouse, the kind of woman who entered rooms at whatever speed she decided rooms deserved. She was the founder and former president of the Canadian Food Service Equipment Council, retired after 31 years, the person who had written the national training standards that every commercial kitchen technician in the country was certified against. She held 2 honorary doctorates. She had been inducted into the Ordre National du Québec 4 years ago. She had been listening to Soleil for 3 minutes. She did not say anything yet. She just crossed her arms, tilted her head, and watched. Soleil walked back to the walk-in unit. She reached onto the panel shelf, found the start capacitor exactly where she'd said it would be, and held it up, a cylindrical silver component about the size of a large battery. Gilles Trépanier's apprentice had set it on the shelf label side down and hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Claude Arsenault stared at it. That's, he started. The capacitor, Soleil said. Yes. She reinstalled it in 40 seconds. Clean hands, clean motions, no hesitation. She knew the orientation by touch before she looked at it. Then she walked to the back of the unit and moved the pallet herself, dragging it across the tile floor with a scrape that everyone in the kitchen heard. She propped the ventilation panel open with a stainless steel tray stand. 20 minutes, she said. The overload protector needs to drop below 60 degrees Celsius to reset. With the airflow clear, it'll get there faster. She walked back to her cutting board, picked up her knife, started cutting carrots again. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of her knife on the board. Nobody moved for about 15 seconds. Then Frédéric Desrosiers, the younger of the two sous chefs, 28 years old from Yarmouth, who had joined Maison Verte 8 months ago and still had enough of his original instincts to be surprised by things, walked over to the walk-in unit and crouched where Soleil had crouched and pressed his own palm against the compressor housing. He felt something, a vibration that wasn't a failure, a readiness. He stood up, looked at Dominic, looked at the clock, looked at the money on the prep table, said nothing. Roland sat down on a stool near the pass and waited. 18 minutes and 40 seconds later, the overload protector clicked. A small sound, almost nothing, and then the compressor turned over. One revolution, tentative, and then it caught, and the familiar deep hum of a working refrigeration system filled the kitchen the way breathing fills a room when someone who has been holding their breath finally lets it go. The temperature gauge on the display panel began to drop. Nobody cheered. This wasn't that kind of kitchen. But Claude Arsenault, who had spent the last 18 minutes standing with his arms folded and his jaw set, walked to the far end of the kitchen and stood there with his back to everyone for a moment that lasted a little longer than it needed to. Dominic Farrell did not look at Soleil. He looked at the temperature gauge. Then he looked at Roland. Roland was already looking at Soleil. She was still cutting carrots. Her knife moved at the same pace it had moved before any of this happened. Even, methodical, quiet. Roland stood up, walked to the prep table, counted the 10 bills, walked to Soleil's station. He set the money on her cutting board. She stopped cutting, looked at the money, then looked at him. "You earned it," Roland said. "Thank you. That's not all." He paused. "I want to know why you're prepping vegetables in someone else's jacket in my kitchen with a Class B ticket and a refrigeration business in your family." Soleil looked at him steadily. "I want to learn to cook. Real cooking. The kind that starts from the beginning. I didn't want to be hired because of what else I know. I wanted to earn my place in the kitchen the same way everyone else does." Roland studied her face for a moment. "That's a very particular kind of pride. My mother calls it stubbornness." Marguerite Willette-Poirier stepped out from near the dry storage. The kitchen staff, to their credit, mostly held their composure, though Frédéric Desrosiers went noticeably still when he recognized her. Dominic Farrell recognized her 2 seconds later. His arms, which had been crossed, came unfolded. "Marguerite," Roland said, not entirely surprised. He had known she was back there. He had noticed her come in. He had not told her to leave. "Roland." She walked toward the prep station. She looked at Soleil the way a person looks at a piece of work they have been hoping to find for a long time. Correct diagnosis, correct sequence of repair, correct identification of the secondary fault that nobody else caught. She paused. "You mentioned the HD78 overload protector thermal lockout. Most technicians with a Class B don't know the reset curve on that model by memory. Most ticket holders don't either. My mother has 3 of these units," Soleil said. 2 in the shop and 1 in the test bay. "I've reset the overload protector on each of them at least twice." Marguerite nodded slowly. "What's your plan, school? Culinary apprenticeship? I'm already in one." "This one." Marguerite looked around the kitchen. At the stainless steel, the cooling halibut, the temperature gauge now reading 4 degrees and dropping. At Dominic Farrell, who was examining a spot on the wall. at Claude Arsenault, who was examining the floor. I sit on the board of the Canadian Culinary Foundation, Marguerite said. We have a professional development fund for kitchen workers showing exceptional cross-discipline skill. It's not advertised widely. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced a business card. Plain white, black text. Handed it to Soleil. Call my office Monday morning. There's a bursary with your name on it if you want it. Soleil took the card, looked at it. Her hand was steady. Thank you, ma'am. Marguerite patted the prep table once with her palm, the way someone marks a period at the end of a sentence. Don't thank me. I just found you. You did the rest yourself. She nodded to Roland and walked out the service entrance the same way she had come in. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Dominic Farrell said, quietly and without inflection, facing the pass rather than Soleil, "Service in 52 minutes, let's move." And the kitchen moved. Soleil folded the money and put it in her jacket pocket. She picked up her knife. She went back to the carrots. Service that night ran flawlessly. The halibut was perfect. The scallops were perfect. Table 6 sent a compliment to the kitchen that Frederic delivered to every station. When he got to Soleil's station, he stopped for a second longer than the others. "Where did you learn to move like that?" he said. "On the unit. You were faster than Gilles Trépanier." Soleil kept her eyes on her mise en place. "My mother's shop," she always said. "Don't touch anything until you know what it's telling you. After that, move fast." Frederic nodded, moved on. The story got out the way stories get out in kitchens, through the back door, into the industry, outward from there. A line cook from a restaurant 2 blocks away had been in the walk-in produce supplier's parking lot when Bernard Oduya's van was leaving Maison Verte, and Bernard, who was still processing what had happened, had said more than he meant to. By Friday morning, the story was on 2 industry group chats and a food service forum. By Saturday, it had been picked up by a food journalist who happened to follow the right Instagram accounts. By the following Wednesday, there was a piece in a regional food magazine with the headline, "The Prep Cook Who Saved a $14,000 Service." The article included a comment from Gilles Trépanier that he gave on the record and almost certainly regretted. "The capacitor was on the shelf the whole time. My apprentice moved it and didn't say anything. I didn't check the shelf. That's on me." It included a comment from Priscilla Markov, who said through a representative that she had no comment. It did not include a comment from Claude Arsenault, who had left Maison Verte for a position at a restaurant in Charlottetown 11 days after the incident, citing personal reasons. Dominic Farrell was quoted once, near the end of the article, in a single sentence that the journalist had clearly had to work to extract. "Soleil Ducasse-Brochu is the most technically precise person in my kitchen." That was all he said. It was, given everything, quite a lot. Roland Ashby-Crane gave Soleil a permanent position at Maison Verte with a junior sous chef track and a salary that reflected what she was actually worth rather than what the industry assumed she was worth based on 6 weeks of vegetable prep. He also had the walk-in unit serviced by a different company and added a refrigeration inspection to the monthly maintenance checklist, something that, in retrospect, should have been there from the beginning. The start relay was replaced the next morning, $42.16, including tax. The bursary from the Canadian Culinary Foundation came through 8 weeks later. Soleil used part of it to take an advanced fermentation course in Montreal and part of it to buy herself a new pair of kitchen clogs. Both pairs fit. She still keeps a strip of black electrical tape in her jacket pocket, not because she needs it anymore, because her mother always kept one, and her mother's mother before that, and some habits are not habits at all but the shape of where you came from, carried quietly into the rooms that try to tell you you don't belong. I want to tell you something before you go. Soleil Ducasse-Brochu walked into that kitchen every day for 6 weeks and said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say. Because she was building something, quietly, in a room full of people who had already decided what she was. That takes a kind of discipline most of us never get to see. The three technicians who left that kitchen without a solution, they weren't bad at their jobs. They were very good at their jobs. But they looked at the problem with the tools they expected to use and listened for the sounds they expected to hear. Soleil looked at the shelf. She watched the apprentice set the capacitor down. She tracked the pallet against the ventilation exhaust. She filed it all away without saying a word, because nobody had asked her, and she understood something that took me a long time to understand myself. The room decides who gets to speak. But the room doesn't decide who knows. If you've ever been the person in the room who knew the answer and nobody asked, drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Tell me your moment. The moment you held the answer in your hands and the room looked straight past you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it this week, and if you're new here, subscribe. Every week on DELL Stories, we find the people the room forgot to look at. The quiet ones aren't waiting for permission. They're just waiting for the right moment to move.